Hello guys, thanks again for watching the series. As I mentioned in the last video, I'm trying to cover this in a broader perspective of the topics that we are seeing in the media the whole time. Today, I'm going to be discussing how different is this crisis from the last ones that we had in history. In order to do this, I'm very glad to introduce Victor Chang. He's a Stanford graduate in quantitative economics. He has an extensive experience working in management consulting for several years in McKinsey. He's also the founder of caseinterview.com website, one of the most prominent websites for people going into the industry. And he's also the author of the book, The Recession-Proof Business, in which he analyzed the past 12 recessions in US. And I think it makes total sense for the conversation we're gonna have right now. Thanks for being here, Victor.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, as usual, I'm gonna remove you for a while, then I'll bring you back during the questions. So the way I'm gonna do this today, it's basically I'm gonna analyze 5 different dimensions, and in each of them, I'm gonna try to compare the numbers that we already have, or expectations, to something that we had in the past. And then trying to make a sense of the whole thing. The first then is gonna be stock market numbers. So probably because this is the one that happens the first. So here, the way I'm gonna do this, basically comparing the decrease in S&P, for example, this is the index I'm using, the percentage decrease before it started recovering. Here, if you look at different numbers, you're gonna see that by far, the 1929 was the strongest one. And now, so I'm gonna compare how many months it took for this index like they were decreasing before they started to recover. And here you're gonna see the evidence are pretty mixed between different prices. When you put COVID in the graph, you're gonna see actually that's very interesting because it was hit less than the other ones, and also it started to recover a little bit faster than the other ones. The main reason for that probably is because this was not a crisis that was born in the financial markets as the other one. So this probably makes a difference in this sense. Another way to look at this is just trying to analyze how many years it took for this index to go back to the level they were before the crisis. Here for COVID, we still don't know, but it's probably going to be much more similar to the last 3 crises that we had than to 1929. That was like 25 years to go back to previous levels. Going to the second dimension, these are the volatility index. So I'm not going to be very technical on this. You basically need to understand this is a measure on how much the prices are varying within the same day, or how far the minimum and the maximum they are within this time frame. And the larger the number of this index, it represents that these prices are varying more. So the whole market is more nervous in a sense. I'm going to start analyzing VIX, which is the most famous one. And here you can see there are 2 very important peaks. One, it was in 2008 with the crisis, and the other is now. When you compare both of them, you're going to see that actually the difference is not very big. So it was a little bit higher in the past, but it's just 5%. Here I have a V2TX, which is a very similar index from Europe. And you're going to see also a very similar behavior. So when you compare the peak from 2008 with the peak that we have now, is actually just a 2% difference. So analyzing this dimension is very similar the way that the markets were reacting now to the way that they reacted 12 years ago. The next dimension is going to be the fiscal stimulus. So here I'm trying to analyze how much money the governments are pumping into the economy in order to avoid a depression. First, I'm going to show as a percentage of the GDP. So you can see that Japan, United States, and Australia are the top 2 ones. Here in percentage values, because in absolute numbers, United States, for example, would be the biggest one here. And here you can see that many other countries, they are putting very significant amount of their economies into pumping money into the economy in order to not just create a safety net for the ones who lost their jobs during the crisis, but also to support especially the medium and small businesses. Another very interesting way to look at this is if you compare the numbers now with the numbers of 2008. And here in the left, you can see the numbers of 2008. In the right, you can see the numbers of now. And you can see that most developed economies, they are putting like 3 or 4 times more money than they put in the past. And especially interesting when you put a contrast in developing economies, because you can see that many of them, they're actually putting less money than they were putting in the past, at least until this point, with some exceptions. For example, Brazil on the top and Italy, South Korea in the bottom. Going to the 4th dimension, which is the labor market. Here, the idea is basically compare the numbers of unemployment that we had in 2009 with the expectations, because these numbers are still moving, that we're having this crisis. So here, if you look at these 5 countries, for example, you can see the levels of 2009. Spain was the one that has the highest numbers at the time. And if you compare 2019, you're going to see that these 5 economies, they're much better or slightly better than they were in the past. So within this time, the economies recovered. But when you look at the expectations of 2020, then you have mixed evidences. So for example, if you look at UK and Germany, they're expected to be much better than they were in the past. While if you look at Spain, France, and US, you're going to see that they might be much worse than they were in the past, especially in Spain and France. And this depends not just on how strongly they were hit by the health crisis, but also on how much sectors like tourism, their economies depend on. Going to the last one, which is GDP growth. And here I'm analyzing this in 2 different perspectives. The first is comparing the advanced economies and the emerging economies. In Norway in 2009, you can see that there is an important difference here. In 2009, advanced economies, they were decreasing 3%, while the emerging economies, they were still growing, so close to 3%. And now you can see that both of them, they are decreasing. Of course, the advanced economies, they were more hit, but both of them, they are showing that they are regressing through the year. And here, if you select some important countries, you can see some very interesting. Japan, for example, you can see it's very similar now, the regression with 2009. But in EU and US, you can see that probably they're going to be twice as hard now as they were in the past. And here I would like to highlight, for example, China and India, because in the past, they were the ones who were still growing very fast, even after the crisis, and they were pushing forward the growth of the whole world economy. And now they are not going to be doing this. They're growing slightly. They're just growing much smaller than they were in the past. So we're going to see the impact also of these countries in the whole economy, because, for example, China was pushing the prices of commodities. And because of this, they were pushing the economies in Latin America, for example. With all of that said, I now bring back Victor to answer some of my questions. So Victor, the first one is is this the most challenging crisis that we saw in the last 100 years?
Yeah, I think when it's all said and done, that's what it's going to look like. If you look at the most recent GDP numbers, particularly in the United States, which is kind of out of self-interest, what I've been paying the most attention to. We saw 5 or 6% decline in GDP for the first quarter of 2020, with really the economy only slowing down in the last 2 weeks, right? So when the whole quarter goes down 5 or 6%, but the economy is only shut down for about 2 to 3 weeks. And it sort of implies, we're in the 20, 30% GDP decline range, for the second quarter. And so, those numbers will come out in a few months. But I think it's going to be quite significant, a quite significant contraction.
Okay. And that brings us to the second question, are there actions that the governments and companies, they took within the last crisis that now they're going to be important to fight this crisis and will help them?
Yeah, so I'm going to tackle sort of the second part of that question, because that's where most of my research has been, is around, in the last 150 years, what did private enterprise do, especially the companies that survived and thrived and did well, and what can we learn from that? And what's really interesting, and one of the big insights, very surprising insights I found, at least certainly in the US economy, is, over the last 150 years, out of every 5 years on average, we've had 1 year of economic recession and 4 years of economic, sort of good times. Yeah. And what we find is almost 70% of Fortune 500 companies were started in recessions, which I thought was very, very fascinating. Yeah. And so what ends up happening is the economy shrinks a little bit, right? So we've shrunk 5% in Q1. In the Great Recession, we're sort of in that range for the full year. But the changes within the remaining part of GDP moves around quite a bit. And so the companies that do well are the ones that really adapt to where the money is moving within the economy that remains. Mm-hmm. The companies that do very poorly are the ones who sort of wait for the economy to come back to, quote unquote, normal. And that is a losing strategy, especially the larger and more severe the recession.
Perfect. And exactly what you're saying brings me to the third question, which is, so especially companies, what they can do in order to be ahead of the curve. Of course, what you're saying, they need to adapt, but how do they do this?
First, it's a mindset thing first, and then it's an action plan. So the mindset is really simple. Follow the money. Where is the money going? It's still there. Trillions, tens of trillions of dollars here in the United States. What is it being spent on? So I'll give you some simple examples. Mm-hmm. Here in Seattle, we were one of the first regions to shut down within the United States. All the restaurants are closed. A lot of businesses are closed. And we've had a lot of innovation, which I've been waiting to see, and I've been pleasantly surprised to see it. We've had the most expensive elite restaurant in Seattle, where it's $500 per meal per person, has now shifted to meal delivery and delivering groceries, delivering wine, delivering alcohol cocktail making kits, and shifted to a full delivery model, which would be unthinkable, just a few months ago. Yeah. There's a company that makes rain gear, raincoats, and equipment people wear outside, outdoors, when they go hiking. No one's hiking because it's illegal right now to do that. They've switched to making masks, right, for healthcare workers and now for citizens in general. And so one of the things is to figure out what parts of the economy are still there, what parts of the economy are growing. One of the things I've had my clients do is I pulled out the list, the government's definition of essential industries, and where I have them all go through, okay, which of these industries, do you still serve, with the hypothesis that, if they're still open for business, they're likely to be a better customer than one that has been shut down because of COVID-19. So that's really the pattern, is to look for what the trends are, to get ahead of them. For businesses, it's targeting different customer segments potentially. Sometimes it's configuring delivery models, right? In-person experiences versus delivery, for example. And also sometimes changing your product lines, sometimes quite dramatically. Yeah. In terms of individuals, looking for jobs and looking for career security, you have to learn to think like the business owners, like the employers. So which kinds of companies are doing well? Which kinds of companies are more resistant, to this particular downturn, given the nature of this downturn being sort of, disease driven. And those are the kinds of employers you want to be paying attention to. If you're being employed by an employer that is in a field that's not going to recover anytime soon, airlines, hotel, online travel agencies, things like that, those represent very substantial risks to one's career and one's income. And it's very useful to have what I call a plan B, right? If your first plan doesn't work out, what is your second plan or your backup plan? Having a plan C, having a plan D. So, and everyone I'm advising, both as individuals as well as CEOs, it's not the plan, because the plan is, the likelihood of it going wrong is high, but it's always what's plan number 1, number 2, number 3, and having all the scenarios mapped out and deciding in advance what you would do in each of those situations.
Yeah, very interesting point. It's quite sad when we go over the media and we see like so many bad news, but it's also hopeful when you see so many, the level of innovation that is appearing, not just from the side of companies, but this can happen also from the side of the individuals. Great.
Absolutely. And one thing I can add to that, just on the news, that's the other big lesson. Don't watch the news. That is the big takeaway. Don't watch the news. And here's why. The news industry, their revenues go up when there's a crisis, and negative headlines, negative news stories that impart danger and fear get higher viewership, which then drives higher ad sales. So it's a very, very skewed perspective with very distorted psychological and financial incentives. And so it's far more important to do what you're doing, is looking at the actual data, right? And making a factually informed decision. Don't make any decisions off the news, because you will be extremely volatile and it will be contradictory. And oftentimes it will be, if not wrong, at least very, very imprecise.
Yeah. And what you're saying brings me exactly to the next question, which is, you analyze the 12 past recessions in the US. You were also saying that you lived already like 3 big recessions in your life. So do you believe that learning and investigating the past crisis can help us better to manage the crisis now or the new crisis to come?
Yeah, I think so. I think, every crisis is different, but there are patterns that emerge. And I think what's interesting about this particular one is it's pandemic driven, right? If COVID-19 and the coronavirus didn't exist, we wouldn't have this particular recession. We would have a different one, probably of a different magnitude at a different time. That's unavoidable. And so what we need to understand is what tends to occur, in a recession. And historically, in other recessions that have been driven by financial crises or one particular sector doing really irrational things, I think of the dot-com boom in 2000, valuations of companies being astronomically high, really overpriced. 2008, it was housing. Way too much financing for housing, way overpriced. And what happens in historical recessions is a correction of excess, right? A correction of the problems that existed before the stock market crash. but it sort of got ignored. And then the crash happens, and then all these adjustments happen. So here in the United States, not enough savings, right? People don't have enough savings to weather volatility, and now you see the consequences of that. And you will see that from here on forward, once the economy does recover, people are going to remember this one, right? And they're going to remember not having enough money or knowing somebody who didn't have enough money. They're going to remember not worrying about whether they can afford food, right? And knowing people who couldn't afford food. And that will leave an imprint. And it's a painful process, but being more disciplined around that and being more conservative financially is a useful outcome of things like this. So I think that's going to be very, very true. I think there will be a return to financial conservatism and realizing, you need money for what's called the rainy day fund here in the United States, savings for when things go bad. I think that's likely to be true. I think you'll see spending become more conservative. Like, do you really need all that? And you're seeing a lot of trends to people sort of spending on the basics, quite a lot, and pulling back on things that are more optional. So those are all very, very predictable patterns and very anticipatable in response to how a particular recession starts and its underlying cause.
Perfect. Very, very, very interesting. In my last question, I would like to get from you, beyond what you already said, if there's any lessons that we probably can take specifically from this crisis that we're living right now.
Yeah, so I would say probably two things come to mind. The first is it will end. This too will pass. That's been very, very true of every recession going back in the United States, 150 years, globally, over 500 years. And psychologically, it feels like it will never get better. And you look at news headlines, you sort of look at some sort of loose indicators of human psychology, and it is just an intense amount of this will never get better. And empirically, not true. It gets better every time. So I think that's one thing that's useful to keep in mind. And one reason also not to watch too much of the news, because it skews that sort of perspective, and to have confidence that that has happened every single time, in the millennium. So that's useful to know. And then I think the second one is to think ahead a little bit around what's going to be different when we come out of this, and to position one's business or one's career to be in alignment with where society is going. So one of the things I talk a lot about is finding the trend, and to borrow a phrase from Wall Street, the trend is your friend, right? And so, for example, the clear trend, in this recession, which I think some of it will persist beyond, is around delivery services, right? Sheltering in place and home, having things come to you rather than you go to it. That has many, many implications for a variety of industries, and which career paths are likely to be more beneficial down the road. So I think those are the two big things around, how we're going to get through it. And when we get through it, we're never going back to the old normal. There will be a new normal, and to make your plans accordingly.
Perfect. I love to close the video with this optimistic view, because I believe after analyzing all the crises and with all the media that we mentioned, it's great to have a message like this. Victor, I would like to thank you again for being part of this video. I'm pretty sure that the people watching will appreciate that.
You're quite welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.